So what I was interested in exploring with my research was the role that hardware plays in traditionally consumer internet web-based businesses. I saw a trend of what we think of as the big three, Facebook, Amazon, and Google, having experiments in bringing hardware products to market. So my quest was, is there a framework or theory that could help me understand why hardware makes sense for a software native company? And I would either find one or create one. So I did kind of a combination of the two. So this quote really stood out to me. This is one of the books I read during my research that dives deep into the strategies of the big four. Apple added to that. And so it says, the four are engaged in an epic race to become the operating system of our lives. And so I think about this as a battle to the death. So this is capture the flag. Not quite a battle to the death. But one example, if we think about the activity of searching, Amazon is quickly trying to capture the flag from Google by co-opting Google's search dominance through product searches. So that's just one example of how this plays out in the market. And so when I say a battle to the death, it really means, competition in the consumer internet space tends to be a zero-sum game. And breaking apart the key activities that happen on the web and mobile, you have search, media consumption, e-commerce, and social. So at any given time, those three players are trying to dominate each of those spaces. So right now, Google is the lead for search, but Amazon is on their coattails. For media consumption, Facebook and Google are in a competition. Facebook just launched Facebook Watch. We'll see what plays out with that. With e-commerce, Amazon is a clear leader. Unclear if either of these two players will make a dent in that impact, in that zone. And then for social, obviously, Facebook is a clear leader. So when I think about hardware within the context of this market dynamic, where does it fit in? Going back to the transition of different platforms, the first platform really was spawned by the mainframe. And then we moved on to PCs that had an operating system as the main interface. That was then won out by the internet with web browsers as the main interface. Then came mobile, apps, and Facebook and Google arguably are interfaces in their own right. So what's next? Here comes the theory of world domination, okay? Prepare to be wowed, or not. So I came across this interesting economic theory to help shape my view on how hardware is strategically important for consumer internet companies. And it's called the law of conservation of profits, created by Clayton Christensen. So the first principle is that profits are earned by the integrating provider in a value chain. So whoever within the value chain integrates all of the services and serves as a gatekeeper. Those profits shift when another company successfully modularizes the incumbent and integrates another part of the value chain. So one example is the publishing business. So traditionally, newspapers, before the advent of the internet, they controlled distribution, and therefore they controlled content and advertising. But with the advent of the internet, for example, Google through search, modularized newspapers and actually broke up all of the content into individualized searchable documents. And they captured the value and the profit from that ecosystem. So I thought about this framework as a way to see how does hardware help companies modularize incumbents. So a key component of why hardware is important is that hardware is a tool to create entirely new human-computer interaction paradigms. So in my theory, this new human-computer interaction paradigm is delivered through a hardware interface that then modularizes the incumbents of those key activities I talked about earlier. So if we go back to the key activities, search, media, e-commerce, and social, what hardware is attempting to do for a consumer internet company is to modularize all of the other players and become the main gatekeeper for all of those activities, creating an operating system for everyone's life. And so what I thought about was, what are the steps and trends that I'm seeing when I analyze Facebook, Google, and Amazon to reaching that pinnacle of modularizing incumbents? And some of the research I did was going through annual reports, looking at product portfolios, listening to investor calls. And these are some of the trends that I isolated that might help both an incumbent and a future incumbent strategize. So the first step would be to design and replace legacy touchpoints. So using new human-computer interaction paradigms, how can you then modularize incumbents? Second would be to drive adoption. So taking this new interaction dynamic, you then deploy that device and keep it simple at first, and then slowly layer on new features and prioritize driving mass adoption, which Amazon has done really well. Then you scale and refine. So this is where artificial intelligence and data comes in. The more data you collect, the better your artificial intelligence structures, the more targeted and specific your interactions will be for your user, driving adoption even further. And then lastly, you monetize. And we'll talk a little bit about, towards the end, how Amazon is actually starting to do this. So really quickly, what I did is kind of mapped out how each of these players fall within this life cycle of hardware strategy. So many of you may be aware of Facebook's first foray into hardware with a partnership with HTC, basically an Android operating skin that was super invasive and people didn't like and didn't buy it. So the price dropped from $99 to 99 cents. But really interesting with the advent of Facebook Messenger, Facebook has started to make investments in that first step, designing new human-computer interaction dynamics. So allowing people to make purchases within Messenger and interact with their customers in new ways. And this was an article that came out about 2 weeks ago. Facebook actually plans to build their own chips for a huge hardware push. So Facebook launched a hardware product innovation lab about 2 years ago, and nothing has really seen the light of day as of yet. So it'll be interesting to see where they land with this. Then with Google, one of their first big hardware projects was the Nexus phone, which wasn't a huge failure as the HTC experiment with Facebook, but it didn't quite reach mass adoption. And what's been starting to see traction is the Google Home smart speaker device. And what's interesting about Google Home is that they don't follow My Amazing Theory. They haven't really optimized for adoption as of yet. They're just starting to do that. What they've been focused on is the AI component of this puzzle. Google did a demo where they created a new feature with the Google Home where you can ask Google Home to make an appointment for you. And it will call that small business and actually sound like a real person and have high order functioning and response. So in one of the examples, someone wanted to make a hair appointment and the initial time that she requested wasn't available. And it sounded exactly like a human being. So Google has obviously focused on making the technology as robust as possible and will drive adoption later. So with Amazon, their first failure in hardware was with the Fire phone, which was a pretty large-scale push to drive adoption, but they weren't quite on base in terms of what the consumer was looking for. With the Echo and Alexa ecosystem, what they did was really strip down to core functionality, drive adoption, and now they're adding on layers. So an interesting finding that I discovered was, as of a couple of weeks ago, Amazon is now going to add a layer where small businesses can accept payments through the Echo and Alexa ecosystem. So Amazon has reached that monetization standpoint right now. So for the last slide, really what I was trying to understand is how do I compare the hardware strategies of these major incumbents? And some of the lessons from this is if you're an incumbent, thinking about where are you on the value chain, what can be modularized, and thinking about what the competitive threats are. And so as you can see, Amazon is pretty far ahead in the hardware strategy pipeline. But to be fair, I think Amazon was kind of an anchoring point for me in my analysis. So as Facebook and Google push more innovations into the market, we'll see how this shifts. So that's it. Yes?
So Apple is sort of the company unspoken here. They seem to have started far more on the hardware side and created that interface, one would argue, with the you have the iPhone and the App Store.
Yeah.
How do they fit into this, and as they
Yeah.
$1 trillion valuation, which is sort of the start of your business?
Yeah. So they came up a lot in my research, and I was trying to focus it on native software native companies. But what's interesting about Apple is that it wasn't really a consensus around whether Apple was a proof point of vertical integration or a proof point of this, offline operating system model. So while they are definitely the model for vertical integration and owning an ecosystem, I think Amazon, for example, has pushed the envelope in trying to dominate, for example, the home and trying to integrate into other aspects of a person's life to get better data and better predictability and targeting. So definitely important and definitely influencing some of the market choices, but there is some uncharted territory as well.
I look at it as, these players have been kind of beholden to the conduit being Apple. Right? So like whether it's Facebook, you integrate, you engage with Facebook for the most part through the Apple device you're on. Same thing with Amazon and these hardware plays, and to try to break that stranglehold they have on that interface.
Yeah, and I think about Android with Google as well.
Yeah.
So Android was a huge success from an ecosystem standpoint, but not from a profit standpoint. So, I see, the Google Home, for example, as one attempt from Google to capture profits and close their ecosystem a little bit. So we'll see what happens. Yes?
So the overall question behind this was the question of hardware and whether it takes hardware to be dominant, right?
Well, not exactly. The question was why is hardware strategically important to these non-hardware companies? And perhaps hardware is important to be dominant right now, but I'm not sure that I can confidently say that. It seems like that's a trend, but it just struck me as odd. So I was trying to figure out how you tie all these decisions together, what's the rationale? And this seems to be the direction it's headed in.
Okay. So would your conclusion be, though, at this point, or do you feel you can say, yeah, you can't just be dominant in other areas. You have to have hardware in there, or not necessarily?
I can't confidently conclude that. I think the success of the Echo was an accident, right? That, in my opinion, that Amazon ran with, and I think, the newest human-computer interaction is this this voice interface. So it remains to be seen if that really becomes a dominant interaction with computers and various interfaces. It could be, but we'll see. Yes?
I was just curious if you could give me your perspective more on like some of the really high-value monetization layer use cases that you were talking about. You mentioned like the payments, for example, but I was just curious about your perspective in your research.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is, again, going back to thinking about how human-computer interaction is changing. One of the biggest, business sources of revenue is advertising. So thinking about different ways that people will engage with content. So some interesting use cases I've seen with the Alexa and Echo ecosystem have been, how do you reshape and reform content so that it's consumable via audio, or that it integrates with different home devices and creates new sources of revenue. The other has been around kind of integrating, when you look at the different types of activities, are there interesting ways to slice and dice activities so they happen concurrently? So for example, if someone is searching for a particular song, could you then have an advertising opportunity that recommends a movie that the song is featured in? So really trying to create new experiences and new insertion points for different types of digital assets is a lot of what I've seen.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
So all three companies, and Amazon being a slight different version of this, but
Yeah.
really just advertising-based
Yeah.
companies, like how much do they think about hardware as a means to serve more, to further that business model, as opposed to creating different new revenue streams and opportunities?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately for Facebook and Google, it's about getting better data to better target ads. And I think diversification of revenue sources is a part of it. But one analysis I did was looking at corporate investments into either from an acquisition standpoint or from an IP standpoint into AI and hardware. And artificial intelligence investments were often a leading indicator for hardware investments. So for me, it seems like hardware is a way to get better data so that you can have better proprietary data to be a more compelling use case for advertising. And in Amazon's case, having better predictability in terms of what someone might want to buy. But Amazon is expanding their ad business as well. So
it's
we'll
just
see.
an advertising world.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. I think it was interesting to see that most of these business models all kind of converge towards the same thing. E-commerce or ads. So
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the other question I had that's linked to that is you keep referring to the idea of closing off that ecosystem.
Mhm.
Apple's been a relatively closed ecosystem for a long time in a lot of ways. Obviously, the App Store being very controlled compared to Google Play, et cetera. Like, do you think that you see in the future a Facebook ecosystem that's relatively closed off, a Google one that's relatively closed off, or no?
That's a good question. I think it depends on how the end user values the interaction they have with that platform. So because Facebook is so focused on a social interaction, I find it hard to imagine an ecosystem that would be closed off where like that social interaction is the core of that use case. For example, a lot of people find content and discover content on Facebook, but if you're looking for higher order information, you'll do a search. If you're looking for something really specific, you'll do a search. But kind of related to your question is this trade-off with wanting to drive adoption by building functionality through third parties, which is an open ecosystem, and then wanting to control the relationship with the end users to capture all the profit, which is a closed ecosystem. So it's really interesting to see each of these companies navigate those trade-offs in different ways, and like how do you close part of the ecosystem while leaving the other part open? It's an interesting trade-off.
So I think there have been some interesting examples recently of when you have hardware like this in your home. There was that Burger King ad that was like, "Hey Google, what is a Whopper?" or something like that.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Like it was a TV ad, and the goal was for the TV to trigger.
Oh, wow.
Based on sort of what you said earlier about everything converging on an advertising model and sort of like similar underlying business models, do you think the proliferation of this type of hardware will continue to go down this path where brands are trying to get further and further into our homes from a marketing perspective? Or do you think that companies might start drawing a line of, okay, we live in people's homes, we need to have barriers?
Yeah, I think that brings up a really great point about the risks of a hardware strategy, which I didn't want to get too much into, but I'm writing about it in the paper. I think two of the biggest risks are trust and data security. And so, again, it's about trade-offs. One of the benefits of these new hardware ecosystems is that they eliminate friction. So if your main value add is that you eliminate friction, but then you introduce new friction by adding this kind of layer of invasive advertising or invasive data collection, it negates the competitive advantage of the product. So I think it, again, gets back to trade-offs, and I think policy will certainly have an impact on that as well. But certainly it's a big risk, and I think the boundaries are being created as they go along and deploy these hardware platforms.